The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, welcome to the show, everybody. I'd like to remind everyone that this is a live call-in show, 343-9927, 343-9927, to talk about your thoughts or questions or rebuttals or comments on the topic of the evening, which tonight will be foreign military activities that Americans are engaging in that the American people don't know anything about. And with me, as usual, is Lang Baker. Good evening, Lang.
Howdy, Wayne.
And we'll try to cover the topic in an interesting and informative fashion tonight. Lang, I'd like to start off first with recalling the events of September 11th, 2001, when in mid-morning in New York City, the planes flew into the World Trade Center and then later on one into the Pentagon. And afterward, many Americans were shocked, and they made these bewildered, plaintive cries of, why do they hate us? And it was clear to a lot of people at the time why somebody would attack America. And I thought right away it was somebody from the Middle East, and sure enough, that's what it turned out to be. But and as we found out, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda had been behind the attack, and he had stated long before that attack that he hated America. I mean, he was involved in the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which was largely funded and trained and armed by the CIA, and he watched as soon as America came into Afghanistan when Russia invaded, but once Russia was vanquished, we pulled out and left a power vacuum and plunged the country into chaos, and he was angry about that. He was angry about America staging troops in Saudi Arabia, but he's quoted here in an interview with CNN where he states, and this is 1997, he states, "We declared jihad against the U.S. government because the U.S. government is unjust, criminal, and tyrannical." And of course, anybody that would have heard that or been reminded of it after the 9/11 attacks would have cried out, well, we're the good guys. We go around the world promoting democracy and freedom. We help everybody. Why would, how could he say that? And it's precisely because people don't know what our government is doing in places all over the world when our government doesn't want us to know about it. I mean, the rest of the world pretty much knows about what we're doing because they're the ones who are doing it too. But anyway, that's why I wanted to talk about our troops' involvement overseas, because we're doing a lot of things that most Americans are not aware of. We don't hear it in the so-called liberal media. They don't promote that. But Lang, you got a good list of countries where we have military operations going on. Can you tell us some about that?
Well, I have some numbers here from the U.S. Defense Department. They're figures from June of this year, just showing how many troops are stationed all around the world, and it's close to 300,000 that are in other countries, not U.S. territories, not Hawaii or the mainland or Alaska. And the great majority of those are in Europe and in East Asia. In Japan, South Korea, and Germany are where the largest number of U.S. troops are stationed. But then they're scattered in many other countries, a total of about 150 countries, according to these statistics, 150 different countries where there are U.S. troops stationed. And the numbers that are released here do not include classified missions. There's nearly 40,000 are assigned on classified missions in locations that the U.S. government refuses to disclose, so we don't know where that large a number of troops are assigned.
Of course, they weren't being too upfront about what they were doing in Niger until 4 soldiers were killed.
Yeah, and the numbers they've released also don't include civilian contractors or military contractors. So there's a substantial number beyond close to 300,000 active duty personnel stationed overseas that are included in the Department of Defense numbers released
Right, and of course,
back in June.
right, and of course the classified missions they don't acknowledge at all. Really, they don't tell us anything. But yet these missions that are going on in Africa and the Philippines, they're not necessarily kept a secret, but they just don't say anything about them.
Well, there's the classified that you mentioned, and there's also the non-military operations. The CIA is taken more of a paramilitary role than it had. I mean, back years ago, they were active with covert operations. A lot of that came out, things they did down in Latin America, but then after that was exposed, then they shifted out of that again, and then more recently they've got back into.
Well, back during the Cold War, they were very active in spreading disinformation. They would find journalists in countries where they wanted to influence their politics and get those journalists to publish, their point of view and generally create propaganda. And people knew what was going on, at least the people in power. They knew what was happening there. And in fact, that's one reason why a lot of the so-called communist countries control their press, is to prevent foreign countries from coming in and spreading trouble by putting out fake, stories, fake news or whatever. So anyway, I focused pretty much on Africa and then some of the stuff in Central America that the DEA is involved with, because they count as an armed organization in America that America doesn't know anything about their activities. But I found an article by The Intercept. The author was Nick Turse, and he's written quite a bit, apparently, about our military involvement in Africa. But he states here that in 2002, the U.S. launched its counterterrorism program known as the Pan-Sahel Initiative, and which later became the Trans-Sahara Counterterrorism Partnership, to assist militaries of Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, before expanding to include 6 additional nations nearby. And the countries I've found, Lang, are Yemen, Qatar, the Philippines, which isn't in Africa, of course, but still the Philippines, Somalia, Djibouti, Libya, Cameroon, Mali, and Chad, and you have a list of far more that I didn't even come up with across Africa. But you got it readily available there?
Right. In Africa, they divided into two portions here. There's the West Asia and North Africa is grouped together, which includes Kuwait, Iraq, Bahrain, Jordan, Turkey, Syria, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Libya, and then 220 and others that aren't broken down by country.
Okay, and
then there's Sub-Saharan Africa, which includes Djibouti and Kenya and Somalia.
Right,
and
okay.
others.
Yeah, and what I found was most of this stuff that's going on in Sub-Saharan Africa with our military is geared toward fighting Al-Qaeda. From what I read about Al-Qaeda, they go to any place in the world where there is civil strife, where there's somebody who's getting their ox gored, basically, and they jump in and help them and align with them and take them under their wing, or so to speak, and that gives them power. They get more members and everything else, and so we've been going over in Africa and operating with governments there to train local troops on intelligence gathering, anti-terrorism activities and whatnot, as well as the use of heavy weapons and small arms and whatnot. But of course, in doing that, our troops come under fire now and then, and of course they get killed or they kill other people, and I'm sure that upsets some people in the region. Plus, one of the things I read was that by arming these groups and training them, a lot of times they're in countries where the government's not that strong, and so like in Mali, a portion of the military that we helped train and arm overthrew their own government, and how many times has that happened well, Al-Qaeda, for one, came out of the Mujahideen, which was largely trained by America, so it's that's kind of the
And
unintended consequences.
you have that's history repeating itself back in the day when they were training military in Latin American countries at the School of Americas, and then you had military coups and whatnot, atrocities committed by veterans of the School of Americas.
Yes, and they made a big deal after protests in America about closing the school, but they reopened it under a new name or something, I believe.
Right, that's what I
So
heard.
it's still going on. We're still operating there in Central America and South America. In fact, speaking of that, let's see. Well, yeah, we got time, I guess. The DEA, of course, we've known they've been in Central America and South America forever. And, of course, our Marines were in Central America, and the CIA was there during the Cold War, as a matter of fact, overthrowing governments and the like, too. You were going to say something? I noticed you took in some breath there. I thought you were going to say something.
Well, I know, that you're aware of the various coups that were backed by the CIA and their Project Condor in Latin America and Argentina and Chile, and Central American countries. And then there was the whole Iran-Contra drugs for arms deal in Central America during the Reagan War in Central America.
Right. Okay, and that, of course, Americans would never have known anything about that if it hadn't blown up in their faces, if it hadn't been exposed by somebody. But, getting back to the DEA's activities, I've found articles regarding Honduras, Belize, and Guatemala and Panama, actually. Let me find my long notes here. But there is a Huffington Post article, here it is, by Dan Kovalik. It states that U.S. DEA kills innocent civilians in Honduras and the U.S. media are silent. And I love to point stuff like this out to people who claim that our media are liberal. They are nothing of the kind. They're basically useless anymore, except as propaganda machines for the people that own them. But anyway, according to the article here states that according to the Honduran newspaper Tiempo, as well as the Honduran human rights group COFADE, not to be confused with COVIFI, the agents of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, dressed in military uniforms, killed at least 4 and possibly 6 civilians in a raid that took place on Friday, May 11th of this year. And basically they were flying in helicopter gunships, and they knew a huge drug transfer was going on. And what happened was the guys got it transferred onto a boat, and they left and began drifting down the river. And there was this ferry that these people were on, just good civilians having a party or whatever, that was well lit and all that. And the gunship mistook this well lit boat for the drug runners. Because obviously, you're running drugs, you're going to have a lot of lights on and, advertise the fact. And they just shot from their helicopters. They shot machine guns into there, and the people were jumping overboard and screaming, and they were shooting them in the water, and they killed at least 4 people, one of whom was a pregnant woman. And as far as I know, the American people never heard about that. But you got to figure some people were hating us, for that one. And there's also there's an article out of Belize, which I think used to be British Honduras, didn't it?
Right.
Okay, and Belize Amandala is the name of the newspaper, Belize's leading newspaper. It states here that U.S. DEA commandos operating in Belize. And apparently, and I didn't know about this, the chief of operations of the Drug Enforcement Administration stated that there was a military-type faction of the DEA which was initially set up to target Afghanistan and the drugs there. And, it worked so well in Afghanistan that they decided, without telling anybody, to start using it in Central America. And it was exposed here during a conference. This article here states that the Afghanistan idea was implemented in Belize as well. And, of course, the guy, Harrigan is the head of the chief of operations of the DEA. He's quoted here as saying, due to the success of this program in Afghanistan and the unique capabilities of the teams, they have been deployed for mission support in Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and Panama. So,
Interesting.
yeah, so we're running these guys around there, killing people probably, and the American people know nothing about it, Anyway, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're talking about all of the military operations going on around the world by American forces, which the American people know nothing about. And feel free to call in and question or challenge anything we say here, 343-9927, 343-9927. Okay, well, what else do you have as far as what we're doing, Lang? Anything in particular that's different from what I was saying?
Well, there's the whole budget side of
Oh, yeah, the
how
cost.
this gets accomplished.
Yeah.
And there's a number of different angles to look at that. There's how much our country spends on its defense budget compared to what other countries spend. There's what we spend in our defense budget and what we spend outside the defense budget that is actually military-type operations, such as the DEA that you've been talking about. That's not included in the defense budget. Such as the Department of Energy, whose primary role is maintenance of the nuclear arsenal, but that's not included in the defense budget. It's a big part of the Department of Energy's budget.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the black budget, which are the secret operations that not even Congress knows what it's being used for when they vote on it, and it's not public except occasionally something gets out, like Edward Snowden released some information about that the Washington Post reported on.
The traitor Edward Snowden. Actually, it wasn't the Washington Post, it was the Guardian of London that broke the story.
Right, they broke the story about a lot of the things that were being done by the CIA, and then the Washington Post had a story later about the budget side
okay.
of it.
Yeah, okay.
And the black budget is
right.
what they
and that's what you
how
were
they
talking
refer to
about,
it,
yeah.
the black budget reporting, yeah.
Yeah.
And then there's all the waste and corruption within the whole budgetary process for the defense industry.
Defense industry, yes.
Yeah.
Well, no, wait a minute. They cleaned all that up back during Reagan. Remember when he held up the $80 screwdriver or whatever and the $300 toilet seat? And didn't they clean all that up? It's no longer there.
Well, maybe the $80 screwdriver is no longer there, but there's a lot still to investigate and to bring to public light.
And we recently increased the military's budget by, what, $56 billion, I think it was?
I don't have
It was a
any-
huge
I don't
increase
have any numbers
that
on
President Trump pushed for. Yeah, and then, there, of course, and I'm getting off topic here, but, there are $100 million sale of military hardware, weaponry to Saudi Arabia, when that region is heating up now with Iran and Saudi Arabia. Who knows what's going on there right now, but they've just declared that Lebanon committed an act of war. They're accusing them of that now. And, of course, Lebanon is the Hezbollah there are largely supported by Iran. And of course, we and the Saudis are afraid that Iran's going to start asserting its strength around the Middle East, as they have been doing in Iraq and Syria. So, here again, we're spending money. We're supporting military operations that are going to end up causing more strife in the future and could cause harm for us.
Yeah, and when you talk about spending the budget, I mentioned the things that aren't included in the defense budget but are actually part of defense cost of our government expenditures, like the Department of Energy and the black budget. But even within the military budget, if you compare it with what other countries are spending, the U.S. military budget is greater than the next 7 largest military budgets combined in other countries.
And how many of those are enemies of those 7 countries?
Well, I'll have to pull out the list, and you can tell me whether you consider them enemies or not. And, number 2 is China. Number 3 is Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
which you were just talking about. Number 4 is Russia. Number 5 is the United Kingdom. Number 4 is India. Number 5 is France. And number 8 is Japan.
Okay, so all but I think China and
China and Russia, you
Russia.
might not.
they're not considered friends, no.
Well, it depends on who you ask, I suppose.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's true.
There's an attempt to enlist China support in dealing with North Korea, and then Trump campaigned on being great friends with Putin. So
Right, yeah. But, yeah, he likes me. I see that as a good thing, right? Yeah.
and then there's what we spend to underwrite these foreign arms sales. Even though he announces a big sale to Saudi Arabia, there's a history. And recently, he was on this Asian trip talking about Japan buying a lot of weapons from the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have to look at how much the U.S. actually underwrites
Really?
the purchase of arms by other countries. There's about 25% of U.S. foreign aid is military aid. So it's not entirely these sales aren't entirely financed by the countries that are making the purchases.
Great. So the taxpayers are paying even more to start wars elsewhere than we even know about, all right?
Yeah, and the U.S. is the largest arms exporter.
Yes,
country
we have been
in
that
the
for a
world,
long
so-
time, yeah. Getting back to Africa for a moment and our anti-terrorism efforts there, so to speak, apparently the Army has been lying about some of their activities, too. In Niger, and I'm going back to this Intercept article here, but in Niger, they were calling... Oh, let me see if I can find it now. They were calling one of the bases there... Oh, yeah, there it is. The article states here, for its part, AFRICOM, which is the African Command, says that its forces are, quote, supporting the U.S. Embassy in the country's capital, Niamey. But the article goes on to state that their troops are also stationed at Base Ariane 201 outside the city of Agadez, a transit hub at the edge of the Sahara Desert in central Niger. And they're supposedly supporting intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations, ISR they call them for short, unless, of course, they're being attacked. And AFRICOM officially calls Base Ariane 201, quote, a temporary expeditionary contingency support location, whatever that means. But the Intercept points out here that they have previously revealed that, in fact, the base is a $100 million drone base in the making. And so it's one of probably many places where America is either already launching drones or hoping to someday. And this does point out, too, that Niger is the only country in Northwest Africa that's willing to allow the basing of MQ-9s, which are the larger, potentially more lethal cousins of the Predator drone, and that now our government is pressuring them to go ahead and allow us to start basing them there. But, that reminded me of something else, too, Lang. We're training in heavy weapons in Africa, basing drone operations there. Couldn't these activities be directed at something for some other purpose, too? And I'm thinking of, we've done a show on this before, too, on the activities of China in Africa. They've been involved in Africa for, 20, 30 years now, investing money, building infrastructure, highways, railways, airports, and establishing communications. And in exchange, of course, they're getting natural resources, but they've been investing a lot of money in Africa, and America has not. But now we're getting all these military bases and establishing relations with these different countries. Actually, we're establishing relations with their militaries, so, and not necessarily their governments. So, I'm just wondering, just based on America's history of doing things like this, we could be compensating for our lack of economic activity in Africa with military activity. And I don't see. I see where you're not going to comment on
Stranger
that.
things have happened.
Yeah, stranger things have happened, and actually they're not so strange, I guess. But anyway, I'm looking at a U.S. News and World Report article here by John Burnett from back in March of 2015. And he opens up with the line, once a largely neglected region of the world, sub-Saharan Africa has quietly become the center of a struggle for influence between what are arguably the world's chief powers, China and the United States. And he goes on to state that yet in a troubling sense, the United States is trailing China, whose economic ties in Africa are deep. And he mentions here that in 2013, trade between China and Africa totaled roughly $200 billion, with Chinese electronics goods and textiles flowing into African nations and African natural resources being shipped off to China. And it states here that Chinese-African trade was more than double the trade level between the United States and Africa. And they praised Barack Obama when he was president. They state here that he convinced U.S. companies to commit about $14 billion in Africa in investment, but then they compare that to an estimated $75 billion invested by China from 2000 to 2011. So clearly, with what we talked about in China's activities and in this article here, China is establishing tremendous and strong influence on the African continent, whereas we're playing catch up, really. And I wonder if someone is keeping an eye toward the future with all these military operations on how, because we're building permanent bases. There's one base there that AFRICOM would not say how many people were going to be stationed there, but they have received a shipment of 80 Quonset hut type shelters, which can house 10 troops per structure. So there's 800 troops right there that, we don't know what they're going to be for. But and one article I read compared. I'm talking a lot here, Lang. You need to jump in. But one article also compared our buildup in Vietnam, how we only had like 3,600 troops in Vietnam in 1961, and by 68 or so we had hundreds of thousands there. And they said, just look out for Vietnam. For Africa now, because we're getting our toehold in there, and it's going to come down to a confrontation, or it could come down anyway.
Yeah, Vietnam was when we had the largest number of troops overseas since the Second World War, and it peaked around 45% of our overseas troops were in Vietnam. In 68, I believe it was, 67 or 68.
Yeah, well, and of course we were involved in Vietnam in the 40s, but most people aren't aware of that either. In fact, we were allies with Ho Chi Minh during World War II. He was fighting the Japanese who were occupying his country.
Yeah, it's in some ways a similar tale to the Middle East, where we had allies who were expecting to have their desires for national sovereignty to be supported by the U.S. after the war, and it didn't turn out that way. And
no.
So you've got a lot of discontent and animus towards the United States for not fulfilling the expectations that the local populations had for independence and freedom.
Yes, for betraying them, basically, which we did with the Philippine troops during the Spanish-American War. We got them to help us against Spain, telling them we're freeing you, we're here to get rid of your oppressors. And once Spain capitulated and left, we stayed, and we ended up slaughtering, I think, 400,000 Filipino people when they resisted us and tried to kick us out. And I didn't learn that in my history books in high school.
No.
But speaking of the Philippines, while we have a couple minutes left, we have troops in Marawi, also in that city where it made the news that there was a big battle going on between the Filipino military and ISIS-affiliated Muslim rebels in that city. But U.S. troops were involved in that too, supposedly for reconnaissance and intelligence and advising the military. But as the commander of the Philippine force there admitted, if the American troops were fired upon, they were authorized to shoot back. And so there we are again. Yeah, they're there, and they're not supposed to shoot or kill people, but if they're shot at, well, all bets are off.
Right.
So, this all could blow up in our faces like another 9/11, or hostages being taken in countries that Americans didn't know were hostile to us because they didn't know what their government had been doing there. This could manifest itself in all kinds of ways that aren't pleasant. And generally, from what I've read too, our efforts against terrorism in Africa aren't really achieving anything positive. They actually are admitting now that it's making Al-Qaeda stronger. The old argument about the harder we try to suppress them, the more terrorists we're going to create, and that's exactly what's been going on, apparently, with our war in Yemen and everything else.
It repeats itself.
Yeah, and, it will continue to repeat itself. But anyhow, I thought that it would be a good idea to at least talk about this tonight and share it with the listeners, to point out this is just the tip of the iceberg, I'm sure, Lang, but, it's good to be aware that your government's lying to you and it's going around the world killing people without you knowing it, because they're doing it in your name, in our names,
And then there's also the lack of transparency in the budgets and where money's being spent. It's not just what they do, but also how much they're spending for programs that they keep secret from us.
Yeah, and isn't defense spending greater than 50% of the total budget?
Depends on how
That
you
they
calculate it,
admit
like
to
we
it.
just talked about.
Right.
The DOE has a big...
Let me rephrase that. That's the acknowledged percentage. Is more than 50%, but who knows how much more of our budget is really going to these so-called defense industries, and
how much of that is just thinly veiled corporate welfare.
Right. Yes, and of course no, but really the big problem with our deficit is just all those poor people taking things and not offering anything back. Right. Okay. Anyway, we got to go. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker on A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. We thank you for listening. We got to go. You have a good night.